Hello, everybody, and welcome to Psyched Out, a podcast focused on all things psychology, like psychological thrillers, unethical experiments, true crime cults, and more. I am your host, Emily, and for those who don't know, I have a bachelor's degree in forensic psychology and a background in law enforcement. This helps me provide unique insight on some of the world's most famous cases, movies, and events. In today's episode, we'll be talking about the Lindsay Clancy trial, specifically days 2 and 3. Again, I know I'm late to the party, but I also work full time, so you guys are going to have to bear with me on this as I catch up. That said, I want to keep as open of a mind as possible. Being upfront, my stance is that Lindsay is responsible for the crime, whether that was premeditated or a result of psychosis, who knows? But I will not be entertaining any of the conspiracies surrounding Patrick because they are irrelevant to the trial in and of itself. In fact, I'll be debunking a lot of them just based off of simple research and like a quick Google. In this episode, I intend to provide commentary on what has been presented so far, my opinions of the prosecution, the defense, as well as additional research surrounding core topics of the case. So at the start of day 2, Patrick's testimony continues where video evidence is shown of him going to the CVS to get Miralax or Pedialax, whatever it is, for Cora. That is a laxative for those who don't know. And Patrick's explanation for this is that Cora was getting constipated and having some stomach pain because she got embarrassed going to the bathroom at school. And this may sound strange for some people, but it actually made me laugh because I was the exact same way as a kid. I actually had to take Miralax in the mornings with my orange juice because I absolutely hated going to the bathroom at school. I thought the bathrooms were gross. There was no way in hell that I was going to be pooping or peeing anywhere in those, so I would just hold it until I got home. Obviously, that caused some problems, so I couldn't help but relate a little bit to Cora in that regard, and so, you know, kids do sometimes get embarrassed to go to the bathroom at school. It may seem silly. It is silly, but I eventually grew out of it. Now, this is when we learned that Lindsay had called into the CVS to ask if they had a specific brand in stock. I can't recall if that was specifically Miralax or Pedialax, but it was one of the two. So Patrick goes to retrieve that brand and it's not there. So he calls Lindsay back and is like, hey, is it okay if I just get the generic brand? She's basically like, yeah. So I have seen people talk about the CVS footage specifically as well as the 3V footage and saying that, Patrick is wearing a completely different jacket. And when I was watching the trial, I didn't notice a difference, to be honest. To me, the jacket looks the same. Now, in the CVS video, only part of the zipper is visible. It's like the little top portion, which has led a lot of people to believe that he was wearing a quarter zip and then changed his jacket somehow. But I am an owner of many jackets and many black hoodies that require a zipper. And for almost any hoodie I own that has a zipper, there is a little bit of fabric that goes over the zipper. It is designed to hide the zipper. And there's a lot of times where, depending on how the jacket sits or the clothing sits, only the top portion of the zipper can be seen because the fabric covers the lower part. And I think that that is very much a possibility. I think that he was likely just wearing a black hoodie and that's why it looks like a quarter zip. And then later he completely unzips it. I don't think people have really talked about that, but that to me seems like the most logical conclusion. As for the shoes, to me personally, they don't look all that different because depending on the lighting, they look more brown or they look more of like an off-white color. So I can't really weigh in a whole lot on that. To me, they look the same, but that's just my opinion. Another theory on the internet is that it really wasn't that cold outside for Lindsay to have her temperature drop that fast because in a series of photographs, you can see that there was a snowman the kids made like the day prior. And then in the scene photos, there is a snowman which has partially melted in the background. And this is, like I said, in relation to arguments surrounding Lindsay's body temperature and whether or not it could have dropped that fast in such a short amount of time. And what people seem to forget is that temperatures drop at night. As soon as the sun goes down in winter, it gets way colder way fast. So a lot of the melted snow is going to have refrozen or is in the process of refreezing by the time that this incident takes place. So yes, while the snow had melted, it's not just going to stay melted. That moisture is going to refreeze, which is why it takes multiple days for snow and ice to completely melt all away. So again, a little bit of logic here goes a long way. Just because the snowman has melted a little bit in the photographs doesn't mean that the current temperature outside is enough to melt the snow. Then we have to talk about the whole, Patrick's a competitive runner, so he had to have run home in between his stops to kill everybody. Um, that theory to me is absolutely insane, and let me tell you why. First and foremost, I was a competitive runner for a very long time, to the point where I ended up getting my college paid for because of athletic scholarships in reference to cross country and track. And what I can tell you is that there's levels to this shit. In the running community, you have very casual runners, people that have no intention of competing and just kind of do their own thing. They may never even enter a race. They may just like jogging around the block. Then you have your casual racers, people that will go to a race here and there, but they really just compete in their local communities and they're not that competitive about it. Then you get competitive runners who participate solely in their local communities or nearby events. They don't really branch out. And then you also have competitive runners that don't have sponsorships but are really good, and are seeking out races to hopefully get sponsorships or win prize money. Then you have your sponsored athletes and your competitive athletes with sponsorships. And then you have your professional athletes and your Olympic athletes. So when you say that he's a competitive runner, that's a very wide spectrum. And so the current world record mile time for a man is 3 minutes and 42 seconds, which was just set by Josh Kerr on July 18th of 2026. Mind you, this is one of the fastest distance races that you can run outside of like the 800-meter dash. These people are trained to run speeds far greater than long distance runners. For example, a marathon runner, which is what Patrick Clancy is. Their ability to run 3:42 is because they are specifically training to run only a mile, not a marathon. And for instance, Patrick Clancy in his Boston Marathon had one of his fastest mile time splits as 8 minutes and 31 seconds, which is a very stark difference between his marathon pace and the world record mile pace. Comparatively, a professional male marathoner, like top percent marathon runner, has a consistent mile split of 4 minutes and 33 seconds per mile to 4 minutes and 48 seconds per mile. And that is still about a minute slower than the mile time. And that's what the top 1% of marathon runners can hold for an entire marathon, which Patrick is not that. And yet the internet is saying that Patrick was able to maintain a full-blown sprint that would break the current world record mile time in order to make it home and kill his kids and try to kill his wife. So this theory stems from people, in my opinion, who fundamentally have no understanding of running, let alone the scope of what it takes to be a competitive runner and a professional runner. And this is coming from somebody who was a silver medalist in a national event in the steeplechase when I was like 14 years old. Now, what about the whole 911 conspiracy? Patrick states on the stand, and I quoted it while I was watching it, quote, "My phone was switching between Wi-Fi and 911, end quote. And so the internet, as one would expect, ran with this, and it kind of got blown out of proportion, where people are like, oh, Patrick waited 9 minutes and refused to call anybody because he needed to connect to the Wi-Fi. Records show that it was at most 2 minutes before he placed a 911 call, which makes sense, right? You get there, you're like, oh my God, what's happening? Oh, what do I do? Oh, I should probably call 911. And then I actually went and asked some of the dispatchers I worked with what would happen if a 911 call kept bouncing between Wi-Fi and cellular data and you just didn't have a stable connection. And they told me that the call can drop or there can be interference with the call and the person would need to call back to try and get a more stable connection. There are other factors as well that can impact a 911 call while on Wi-Fi. For instance, Verizon was saying that, if your address isn't recognized or you have a change in location, your call may not go through. And you can also have conflicting Wi-Fi networks, so your phone may be bouncing between two different networks, and then that confuses the way that the call is routed through 911. So that was something that I learned, and I actually was able to go to the source just because of my background, and I got an answer that should hopefully put that to rest. And again, like that was something that I didn't know and I learned, so now I'm passing it on to you guys. Let's take a step back from the internet conspiracies to talk about the discussion surrounding how the children were found. So, one of the biggest things I didn't know is how the kids were found in different areas. I was under the impression that they were all in one area together and kind of like lined up. But that's not the case. So, Dawson was in a separate area from Cora and Callan, and this separation is indicative to a certain extent of premeditation. That's what the prosecution is arguing. The going theory here is that Lindsay picked the middle child, Dawson, put them in an area where Cora, the eldest, wouldn't be able to see them, so that she could then go get Cora and Callan down to the basement without issue. Same if it had been Cora there murdered first in the separate room, and then she went and got Dawson and Callan. The way that I think, and again, I don't know this for sure, is that it may have been easier to get Cora to go somewhere with her and be more willing to comply to go down to the basement with her mom than, say, Dawson, who's a little rambunctious boy. Now, hiding one child in a separate room means that the perpetrator had the wherewithal to recognize that leaving the child out in the open to be seen would cause a negative response from the other children if they were old enough to understand what was happening, right? So if it was Dawson that was killed first or Cora that was killed first, if you leave them out in the open, you bring the other ones down, they're not going to react well to that. So that's kind of the argument that the prosecution is going with. And I would tend to agree that if you're able to have the mental capacity to know you need to hide one kid and keep them separate from the others, that would indicate that you have enough cognitive awareness to understand that what you're doing is wrong, and that would indicate premeditation. Another thing we have to discuss is Lindsay's outburst or lack thereof. While the prosecutor holds the clothing of each child, what they were wearing when they died, there is absolutely no reaction from Lindsay. The prosecutor held up a tiny pink little robe that Cora was wearing, and it absolutely broke my heart, because one of my favorite things that little kids do is they love wearing bathrobes or snuggies and things that are just slightly oversized, and it just looks so cute and ridiculous on their tiny little bodies. It is absolutely adorable. And then the other thing that really got me is Dawson's little dinosaur shorts or underwear. I can't remember if it was sleeping shorts or his boxers, but like having dinosaur underwear is such a little boy thing to do. And to be honest, I got a little emotional and it got a little reaction out of me, and I'm not even their mom. But she was able to sit there collected and calm throughout all of this, and yet the moment that the prosecution wants to play the 911 call, all of a sudden she just has this big emotional outburst, and the court has to be, there has to be like a sidebar and the jury has to be ushered out. Like, it turns into a whole thing. And it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And to be completely honest with you, it comes across as manipulative. And I made a TikTok on this and people aren't happy with me for it, but I'm also aware that she conveniently had a large emotional outburst when autopsy photos were shown. And granted, I'll play devil's advocate here. That can be that's very emotional and that's very triggering for somebody. So I can understand having that type of response. But it does seem weirdly selective to me that it's only at times in which the prosecution is trying to submit very key, important, emotionally charged evidence when, a few minutes prior they're holding the clothes of your dead children and you have no reaction. It's just very peculiar to me and very interesting to me, from an outside perspective. And I do think that there needs to be something said about, and I kind of addressed this in the first episode of this case, which is that Lindsay is seen as a sympathetic character. So people don't like when myself or others call out the fact that she, very likely, there's a very real possibility that she's being performative in her crying. People seem to forget that there's two possibilities here, right? There's the possibility that it was psychosis and she killed the kids, or the possibility that she premeditated all of this and killed the kids. And if she's capable of premeditating the murder of her 3 children, then she's completely and totally capable of manipulating the jury and having the wherewithal to say, hey, I'm going to cry now so that this evidence gets overlooked by the fact that I had this big emotional reaction. People don't like that that's getting brought up. They are very upset with me for it, but I stand by what I said. I think that it's weird. I think that it's very strange. And I think it's a very interesting pattern of behavior. And when stuff sticks out like that, that's because it's important. There's another thing that I thought would have gotten a more emotional reaction, because it definitely sat with me, which is Cora's Christmas list. She was asking for a scientist set and a unicorn wallet. And to me, there's something very special about a little girl being interested in science, but then also still wanting a unicorn wallet and like maintaining her whimsy. Just like the dinosaur underwear, like this is such a cute, precious little girl thing to do. And just knowing that there was a little girl interested in STEM and science and things like that, it really breaks my heart thinking about what could have been. And so it's just interesting that as a stranger, and this isn't to like gas myself up or anything, stuff like that really sticks out to me and makes me sit and go, wow, that is really heavy and that is really sad. And yet the mother of the children is sitting there not having any reaction whatsoever. But that's just how I feel about that. I felt that it was important to know and give my stance and opinion on it so you guys aren't blindsided by anything. We then get into the whole CVS manager being asked what Lindsay sounded like on the phone and if she could be understood or was making any sort of sense in the conversation. And the prosecution, what they're doing here is they're trying to establish that Lindsay had organized thoughts and organized speech because people in psychosis often experience, or, other mental health crises often experience, um, disorganized thoughts and disorganized speech patterns. They will not make a lot of sense. Sometimes their words are slurred or they make statements that don't fit into the context of the conversation at all. And this is something that I have seen regularly in my own work. It's actually very off putting the first time you experience it because you're like, whoa, like what's happening, because they look normal from the outside. You wouldn't really know that something's wrong, but with the way that they are interacting with you, the way that they're talking, their thoughts, their words is indicative that, hey, maybe they need some help. And the CVS manager ultimately testified that Lindsay was speaking and responding clearly, which would indicate that she was of sound mind. The three V hosties also described Lindsay as being logical in speech and thought. She even testified that Lindsay was cognitively aware enough to articulate the specifics of the order, such as different protein options. And this testimony was done to establish Lindsay's mentality at the time the crime was being committed, because we have to remember that she's making calls immediately prior to killing the kids. Um, so there's an argument from the prosecution that's like, well, look, this is premeditated because you expect me to believe she suddenly entered psychosis just 5 minutes later. So that's kind of the angle that they were going with that. And one thing in particular that I don't think people have addressed is that there's a very good likelihood Lindsay was well aware of and interacted with people suffering from postpartum depression or postpartum psychosis, especially because she is a labor and delivery nurse. So the prosecution, which I haven't seen them do this yet, and maybe I just haven't gotten there, um, the prosecution, in my opinion, would hopefully try to use this to say, hey, this is indicative of possible premeditation. She knows how this mental illness works. She knows how this represents or presents in people. Um, but they're not doing that. So I don't know if they get to that at some point or if they decided not to work that angle because it would be hard to prove. But again, this is just indication of possible premeditation and like where the prosecution could go with that. There's a very real chance that the postpartum, and honestly, I think it's very accurate that she had postpartum issues and that it was an accurate depiction of what she was going through. Then we move on to day 3, where we have a bunch of first responders testifying to what they did, observed, saw, and heard while on scene. We have Officer Stephen Hall, who discusses how Lindsay was making vocal utterances, but was unable to answer questions due to an altered state of consciousness. He stated that she would gain consciousness, move around, flail around a little bit, and then go unconscious again. However, she was still able to use her vocal cords to make noise like moaning, groaning, things like that. Officer Hall states that he then hears Patrick scream from inside the house, and he describes that he ran inside to assist Patrick, which is when the children were found dead in the basement. Dawson was found on his back, and Patrick had removed the exercise band, which is something that I found notable because I saw a lot of people online talking about how all of the kids were found face down, which meant that Patrick didn't help any of them. He didn't do CPR on any of them, therefore, he killed his kids. And very clearly, if they had been watching the trial, they would know, well, Dawson was found on his back. He removed the band from Dawson's neck. Officers saw him doing this. We also have multiple first responders say that, as I mentioned, Patrick assisted the kids, but the first kid that they saw him assist was Dawson by removing the band around his neck. Officer Brian described how quickly paramedics arrived on scene and began to assist all of the children. And Officer Brian was another individual that responded. Um, Officer Brian also made statements that Lindsay was mumbling incoherently while he was with her, again indicating that she was able to speak and had use of her vocal cords. Again, this is important because the internet believes her neck was so deeply crushed it meant she was completely incapable of talking at all. Yet we have multiple first responders saying that Lindsay was able to not only make noise but mumble statements. They were just incoherent, so they didn't make a lot of sense. Then we have the fire captain PJ talk about the descriptions of the kids' bodies when they were found. He mentions that they were blue in the face, pale, gray, and limp. And again, there is absolutely no reaction from Lindsay when this is mentioned, which again I find very strange because she also didn't have a reaction, as I mentioned earlier, when it came to Cora's Christmas list or the kids' clothing. And then she had a big fuss about the 911 call. Um, so I'm very interested to see how this continues to play out. And if there's more instances of this happening, I am aware, like I said, of the autopsy issue, because that clip was going around on the internet and I just saw that. So just stuff that I noticed that I think is important to keep in mind. The other thing I want to say is that the first responders did an excellent job given the circumstances they were faced with, because I can't imagine going into a scene thinking, oh, yeah, we're just going to deal with an attempted suicide, and then all of a sudden having to deal with 3 dead children. And I can't imagine having to live with that for the rest of their lives. In a way, are also victims of what happened, because that's not something that they are going to move on with very easily. But one thing that I really want to take time to hone in on are some other aspects of the case that I believe deserve some attention. And for one, I want to discuss the effects of trauma on memory, because a lot of people are pointing to minor inconsistencies as indicators that not only is Patrick lying, but so is law enforcement, so are the firefighters, etc. For instance, Officer Bryan stated that Lindsay was bleeding when he arrived on scene, but Officer Hall stated that she wasn't. Patrick stated there was a lot of blood in the bedroom, but the photo the prosecution showed didn't show an exorbitant amount of blood. The first thing I want to mention is that people interpret events differently. So for me, the blood in the photo isn't a lot because I've seen scenes that have way more blood than that. And that is how I classify what is or isn't a lot of blood. But for someone like Patrick, who isn't used to seeing blood everywhere, like that's going to seem like a lot. Same with the officers. They have very different criteria for what constitutes active bleeding, and that can affect how their brain encodes the information and what they say later. But when it comes to trauma and memory, here's what's important to consider. So, according to a study in the International Institute of Academic Research and Development, quote, exposure to trauma can lead to alterations in memory processes, including disturbances in autobiographical memory, fragmented or intrusive memories of the traumatic event, and difficulties in differentiating between past and present experiences. Furthermore, trauma can also impair various aspects of cognitive functioning, such as attention, concentration, executive functioning, and problem solving skills. End quote. Autobiographical memory is exactly what it sounds like. It's memory pertaining to one's own life, events, and actions. Trauma can impact how well we recall things and how we recall the things that we did or the things that we said. Meaning that small inconsistencies from Patrick or first responders actually make a lot of sense when we look at how the brain works. The study goes on to specify that, quote, memory disturbances are also commonly observed among trauma survivors, affecting different aspects of memory. Episodic memory, which involves recalling specific events and personal experiences, may be fragmented or altered, making it challenging to accurately recollect past events. End quote. This doesn't mean that people are intentionally lying, simply that their brain's recollection is inaccurate because of the way that they encoded it due to the trauma of the situation. The study discusses how this may present itself, quote, one prevalent manifestation is in episodic memory, where individuals may experience fragmented recollections or gaps in memory related to traumatic events. These memories may be vividly recalled with intense emotional reactions, or conversely, avoided altogether due to associated distress. End quote. And this would explain some of the reactions that we see in court, why certain people are much more emotional about what's happening than others. Honestly, this could even go for Lindsay. This may be an explanation for why her outbursts are the way that they are. I think it's also really important to revisit our understanding of family annihilators. There has been a lot of debate as to whether or not Lindsay would even fit the pathology of a family annihilator. And while I've discussed this in my first episode of the series, I did further research and was able to learn that there are multiple types of family annihilators. And one particular study examined female family annihilators, finding that, quote, despondent types were profoundly depressed and prone to rumination, much like Dietz's theorized family annihilators. They viewed the murder of family members as acts of mercy or rescue from impending disaster. With female perpetrators, though rare, they are most likely the despondent type, end quote. This differs greatly from their male counterparts, who are much more hostile and accusatory, meaning they are very overt in their actions, threats, and intentions. They don't really hide it well, which would explain why no one knew what Lindsay was going to do, if we are to assume that this was premeditated. And that could be like people didn't know what was going to happen because of the psychosis side of things. But again, if we're looking at it from the premeditation lens, it's because if she is the despondent type, which would make sense based on the study, her planning was not going to be as obvious or overt as it would be if she were a man, or what we're used to seeing in men. Another thing I'd like to discuss is that the kids were killed by strangulation. And if you've been around the true crime world long enough, you'll know that strangulation is one of the most personal ways to kill somebody. But I also want to dive into that a little bit more. So, while researching strangulation homicides, I came across a study that talks about the typologies of killers who use strangulation, as well as the differences in manual versus ligature strangulation. In an article for the Journal of Forensic Sciences, the author states, quote, "Manual strangulation may indicate a more spontaneous or emotionally charged attack, often observed in domestic settings. In contrast, ligature strangulation could suggest premeditation and possibly a colder, more calculated approach typical of serial killing." End quote. The study goes on to posit that there are actually four typologies in the world of strangulation homicides. You have the excessive, which is categorized by torture and intense abuse, so it's not just about the strangulation itself, it's about events leading up to it. Then you have intended, which is categorized by a specific plan, often seen as cold, premeditated, and calculated. Then you have personal, which is categorized by specific violence, such as shooting, or acts such as hiding the body, or, strangling somebody with your bare hands. Lastly, we have the sexual typology, which is pretty obvious and makes a lot of sense. I don't really think that I need to go into that one. And then there's hybrid types, meaning that there's combinations of these typologies. So you may have somebody who is an excessive and a sexual type. And I would speculate that, if anything, Lindsay would be an intended typology with hints of a personal typology. Again, a little bit of speculation because I don't know for sure. I'm not best friends with her, so I don't know her well enough to make a complete and total determination. But those are the things that I thought really needed more attention, that I was willing to do some research on. Again, all of the articles that I reference, my primary sources, are going to be in the description of this video. So if you guys want to go read them for yourselves, feel free to do so. Again, I am still catching up on this case. I understand that, my opinion may not be for everybody. That's perfectly fine. I don't expect people to agree with me. Let me know what you think. What are some things that you would like me to look into and answer for you guys? I know that, it's very hard to keep track of everything. So if you have to take your own notes as well and then come back and say, "Oh, hey, I just watched this day of the trial," when you get to there, can you, talk about this? I'm perfectly fine with that as well. I just think that there needs to be some, more detail in some of this stuff, to really talk about why we may be seeing what it is that we are seeing. Again, I do think at this point in time, I'm leaning more towards the idea that while Lindsay had postpartum depression, I do think that there are hints of premeditation. Whether or not the prosecution can articulate that remains to be seen, because, in my opinion, the prosecution is very immature and unprofessional. They basically throw tantrums whenever a witness doesn't act the way that they want. So I could see that being very off putting for the jury as well. And a situation where it's just not received, and so the defense ends up getting some points in their category. I think that the defense has its own issues. I think the touching is really weird between the defense attorney and Lindsay. I don't think that you would really see that, and if it were a female defense attorney and a male client, that would be a whole different thing. So that's interesting in and of itself, but again, I digress. So that is my analysis of day 2 and day 3. I'm still trying to catch up, so please bear with me. Honestly, there's a good chance that this trial will be over by the time I catch up. But that is all I have for now, guys. Please take care of yourselves. Stay safe out there. Like I said, if you have any questions, please let me know down in the comments. And as always, stay psyched out.